to the Restoring Our City podcast, where we have candid conversations on today's topics to help connect our community. And we are in a new series called the Church Complaint Box. So if you haven't already, please like, subscribe, follow us for all of our content on all our social media channels to get the latest updates. We are in episode 2 of the Church Complaint Box. And as we pull out church complaints, this is a big one. And I am here with my fellow co-host, Jeswin Thomas. And Jeswin, when was the last time you entered into a church and you were just inundated with the fog machine so much that you couldn't just breathe?
Yeah, that literally happened in 2020. Me and Stephanie were church hopping a little bit, trying to figure out where we should land as a married couple. And I do remember the Sunday when we walked into a church, great church. Some of our friends go there, but I remember the filters on sort of like the mics just to add some ambiance, a little bit of the smoke machine going on. And I'm like, you know what? Look, we're not going to knock it. Maybe we'll knock it. Find out later on this episode. But it's just one of those things where it's like, I don't know about this for me personally, you know? But then again, I want to sing a hymn every single Sunday. So that's where I'm at.
Okay. Well, I'm impressed that you know the year right when I asked that question. It's not like we prepped that ahead of time, but honestly, that's pretty crazy. I think about that too. And the reason I bring it up is because as we talk about church complaints, probably one of the biggest ones when we look at data and research is people have a hard time with megachurches and celebrity pastors and just that culture. People complain about that when it comes to Christianity. And I think about that a lot. I have a similar story. I was church hopping with a friend and we were going all over the city in Chicago when I was there. We went into one church and it was great message. Worship was great. But like the first words out of our mouth when we like went to the lobby and we were like both asking each other, "Hey, how was church?" And all we could think of is like, it was too electronic-y. I don't even know if that's a word. It was just strobe lights. It was just too much smoke. It seemed kind of like a club, but you knew you were in the club. It was very different. I don't know. Like it just seems, I get where people are at when their complaints. And do you think it's legitimate? Like when you think about this, we have different experiences, kind of the same experiences, but is it legitimate that people are complaining about this?
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad that you said the church that you went to with all this stuff had a solid message because typically when people do complain about the performance, I feel like it's almost like, hey, let's put a concert and some feel good story sort of speech at you, but it really lacks substance. And I think in those cases, yeah, I think that's where the complaint is legitimized, in my opinion. You know, luckily you didn't experience that. It was almost like a, hey, this is an add on top of something solid. But yeah, a lot of times it's just masking lack of depth, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I think there's like multiple aspects to it. But the reason why we want to bring it up is because people are having lots of complaints about the church nowadays. And I think the one that we're tackling today is kind of this performative Christianity, right? Like there's this idea that there's a lot of hype and a lot of celebrity status around pastors. And actually, just citing some data from the Barna Group where they talked about, like, why do people distrust the church? And at the bottom of the list is mega churches at 16%. It's like a really negative sentiment versus what do you think about Jesus Christ? And it's like 70%. It's like this really positive number and the Bible. And conceptually about Christianity, people see it positively. But when you think about mega churches, celebrity pastors, and things like that, it's really negative. So we want to dive into like why that is. And it seems like it aligns with a lot of our experiences. And we want to tackle like, hey, is this legitimate? Do people have a legitimate gripe? And then what does it actually do for the public when they see Christianity in this lens? You know? So as we talk about that, I think there's something that we do have to ask, right? Like, what's the difference in like maybe excellence in worship when we talk about, like, we got this big production value, but then like there's this, really excessive version of production. Do you feel like
Mhm.
there's a difference or is there like credibility in like the smoke machine and why it's there and what the purpose is?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, right? I mean, it's almost like I don't want to go down the aspect of almost nitpicking and saying like smoke machines not good, you know, like and so if you go to a smoke machine church, get out. You might have to get out for your lungs, but that's okay. But on the flip side, with excellence, performance, it's almost like this, right? Like if the substance is there, then I think the artistry is fine. In some senses, all of our churches have some artistic value to it. Some of us might consider some things preferentially excessive, and that's fine. Some of us may not see that as excessive but excellence. But really, the question is, what's the heart and the substance behind it, right? If it's shallow with all of that on top, it's not worth it. But if there is depth, and there might be some things that you see and being like, hey, is this too excessive or not? It's really the heart and the depth, right? Some people might say, hey, this really enables us to get into sort of, the presence, or feeling like we're in a different experience that really helps us to connect with God. And that's fine, and think preferentially that's some people's, experience. For us, maybe not. But well, yeah, what's the depth? I think rather than
Yeah.
looking at the aspect, what's the depth behind it?
Yeah, and I think that's a good clarification. We're not here to say all mega churches are bad or every time you have neon lights or that color, you're not a biblically based church. And I think context matters, right? You could probably talk to somebody from a different part of the world and they come to the Western church and it could be the tamest church, but you got a couple guitars on stage and they might say, wow, this is way too excessive. Why do you need
Mhm.
all of that to worship the Lord? So I think context matters. The people you're talking to matter, and I think what we're trying to address is the complaints. Like, why do people have these complaints and address the heart of it, like you said? So, when we think about maybe even diagnosing the problem a little bit, when we say, ask this question, is this legitimate? Like, where is the gripe? Where do you think the heart of the complainers come from? Like, what's their gripe? And why do they feel so strongly about the church in a negative light when it comes to mega churches and celebrity pastors?
Yeah, and I don't even know if it's a mega church problem per se. I think this is one thing that all of us that grew up in an Indian church can relate to. It is a hypocritical worship leader, right? It is this idea of the people that are leading on stage. If you look at their lifestyle on a Friday or Saturday night, it's like, how do you go out to the clubs, wake up on a Sunday morning, and just, start singing as if your entire life is the holiest of holies? All the parents looking at you, giving you the praise, being like, oh, you should be like X, Y, or Z because look how they play, the guitar and lead songs, and look how holy they are. But it's really the hypocrisy, right? I think the heart behind this complaint is the hypocrisy of saying, the way that you are presenting Jesus to be, either through your life or through your worship style, is not in alignment with who he is. And therefore, we see the hypocrisy. And I think there is a sense of a righteous anger to it, if you will. I don't know if you would go that far to say the same thing, Joby, in terms of righteous anger, but I do think that's the heart behind what the problem is. It's hypocrisy.
So you're saying righteous anger from the complainers?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Mm.
I think, if we are gonna look at these things and we believe that they are not in alignment with the holiness of God, but it's purporting to be holy, I think there is a sense of anger because the righteousness of God is almost misrepresented.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think a lot of the complainers, if I had to visualize the complainers who are submitting this in the church complaint box, a lot of them probably do have some righteous anger because they can see through the facade, right? They can
Mhm.
see the hypocritical heart of some of these people. But at the same time, there's a lot of people at church who are just haters and they just hate on everything, right? They just nitpick. And then to your point, like let's say it's the smoke machine and the lights. They're like, oh my gosh, this is not the gospel. And I think that's a little bit nitpicky without understanding the heart or the why. Like when you dim the lights to see the screen better and the lyrics show up and it actually helps lead the congregation in worship, there's actually legitimate reasons why the ambiance and environment is set up one way. But to your point, like we got to look at the heart behind everything, right? If you're just making an entertainment type of space to be very performative, what's the heart behind it? What's the substance? Because then it could be very performative. So I think, yeah, having this righteous anger, I hope most of the people who are complaining about this have a righteous anger about it because I think that's what we need to do to hold people accountable, right?
Well, there are people that are going to complain in this bucket too, against churches, against styles, against leaders that don't have any righteous anger. They're, like you said, they're just the constant complainers. You go back to the children of Israel in the wilderness. No matter who the
Yeah.
leader is, right? Moses and Aaron reading righteously, saving their butt time and time again. These people complain nonstop, and I think there's people in this bucket where no church is ever going to be good enough, no leader is ever going to be good enough. You want a reason just to complain ad nauseum. So it's almost like if you're complaining because the heart of the church is wrong, I think there's a righteous anger to it. But if you're just complaining because your heart's wrong, I think
Yeah.
that's just foolishness, right? Like there's a righteous
Yes.
anger from God toward you.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's why we want to address some of these things because it's not just like, hey, are the complainers wrong or do they have a legitimate gripe? I think, yes, they do have a legitimate gripe because we've seen this, especially in the Western world. And even in our ethnic spaces, too, we see versions of this. But why is it such a problem? Why does performative Christianity turn people off? What's so bad about it? Why are people so worked up about encountering people like this?
Yeah, why is it wrong? Like, maybe let me ask a question too. Like, how do you define performative Christianity? Are we just saying anything that has, like excellence in terms of like a performance value? If it looks like a concert or if it seems like, a feel good talk, are we calling that performative Christianity or is the style of the like what exactly is how do you define that?
Yeah, I think when I see performative, it almost seems like a show where it's not just your typical church service. So, just to kind of give some examples, a lot of times where I see an uproar about the church, and especially when it comes to performance or comments about a show, are celebrity pastors. Like I've seen some sermons where there's literally, we got to pull up the clip, but there's like a pastor dribbling a basketball court or
Yeah.
basketball on the stage, and like he had a makeshift hoop and he was just shooting. And maybe out of context clip, but it was just for a few minutes just shooting. And I'm like, what's going on? And then you get other clips about like famous pastors and maybe even just the church itself driving a Tesla through the church. I know probably it wasn't a service or Sunday service, right? Like stuff like that. It seems very performative. Like, why do you have to show and showcase things that just seems like so outside of the Bible? And I think that's where people have a gripe. That's where I'm coming from. That excess.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So this idea of excessive, do people and again, right? Like I would love to see the context of why are you dribbling a basketball? Like the
Yes.
pastors. I think I saw it on the pastors with props page at some point, but it's just one of those things where like, well, I'd be curious to see it in context. There's some things where you don't even need to see it in context, this is probably not good. Anything with Mike Todd and an example, we're calling it out here, right here on the pod. Yeah, this is probably not a good thing. I saw this dude pour maple syrup on the Bible and saying like, "Why does this matter?" Right? And I think it is one of those interesting things, and I just wonder, is this a problem not for the entire gambit of Christianity? Is this a problem for Protestants, right, in
Mm.
specific? Because if we think about it's not just why Gen Z is coming to church. Why is Gen Z attracted and actually going toward traditional churches over Protestant churches? I think this has a huge part to it. It's because we are sort of watering down what church ought to be in order to fit a cultural norm, but that's become so excessive, if not entertaining, that it's losing the meaning, and the audience itself is seeing that, and the stats I think are pointing toward the fact that people do feel this way, right? Like it's not something that we have to justify. It's something that we're seeing in the numbers of this Gen Z revival isn't a Protestant revival. It is actually a traditional revival going back to something that is rooted, grounded in tradition and something sort of beautiful and something that is taking away this just let's make everything to the norm of the culture and almost saying let's elevate it back to where this thing ought to be, right? Like, and I think that has a huge part to this.
Yeah, and I think that's a valid point. However, I'll share maybe a counterintuitive point of view because I saw a clip today, just scrolling through and saw a mega church pretty large, Sunday service, tons of people in there, and the pastor comes down, walking down the aisle with, like, the camera, almost like a comedian, like, going down, videotaping the audience, and he goes to the very back row, and he sees somebody sleeping, and he, like, has the camera zoom in, and the lady gets startled, and it's like he's calling her out, and people are laughing, and it has nothing to do with the sermon, but he's just, like, literally going around the congregation, and I think it was John Crist, the comedian, and he started looking at the clip and then he said something like, "If you have a problem with this, it's probably because your church doesn't engage or attract that many people into your services." So he's almost talking about, hey, those churches are probably doing something right, even with all this performance and gimmicks and excessive production because the building's full. So how do you discuss that? Because it almost seems like there might be something working, and Not that I necessarily agree with that take, but is there something working where they're going to keep piling on the maple syrup or the Teslas or whatever it is because the building's full, something's resonating with the public. How do you
Yeah.
feel about that take?
Yeah, the temple was also full before they crucified Jesus. So that's what I would say to that take, right? It's not about the numbers and what it looks like. It really is, again, like what the presence of God should be, right? If we think that God doesn't care about how he wants to be worshiped, then we have not really read the Old Testament. The amount of detail that goes into just figuring out the curtains of the tabernacle is an incredible couple chapters, right? Like we are foolish to think that the method doesn't matter. Now, not to say that we have to become super prescriptive on what that looks like, but there is for sure a description of God's holiness and expectation of what it comes to when he expects his people to worship. The second thing that I'll say to this too is, we've seen this cycle in Western Christianity too, where we're in the seeker sensitive sort of model. The problem is seeker sensitivity might have a lot of people, but the turnover in those church rates later on, or it happens in droves, right? It's either you have watered down the gospel so much that you're not actually producing holy disciples. The ones that do want longevity and depth end up leaving the church to go places where they can grow more. And the others that were just in it for the show end up leaving anyway. So it's not a model that ends up working. So that's the two things I'll respond to that to John and Chris too. Let's call them out. Mike Todd's out. John Chris out. Who's next?
Tag everybody in these clips. It's funny. I was in small group this week and we started talking about, making room. That's kind of the theme of our church series right now. And it was really interesting how like my pastor started talking about this comment that hit me that God is omnipresent and he's everywhere, right? But he doesn't dwell everywhere. And it's
Mm,
almost like this idea of, yes, he is everywhere, but you invite him in and he dwells with you, like Exodus 25:8, and let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst. This idea that we have to prepare a place that God wants to be part of, and we invite him in and we welcome him in. And like sometimes, yeah, we feel like we just built the building and it's not a habitable dwelling place for God himself. That's a great point. Like just because the building's full doesn't mean that God's in the midst, right? I think that's really interesting. And maybe we should look at scripture to understand like what relevance that ties to all of this. And I think we started to look at a few things, but maybe we could just look at a quick passage in Matthew 15, verses 8 and 9. And I'll read it really quickly. And this is when the Pharisees and scribes came to Jesus and they started questioning him, right? And they started accusing him. Why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? For they don't wash their hands when they eat. So I'll just skip down to actually, I'll read verse, 8 and 9. Actually, 7. Let me start off there because it's a key verse there. Hypocrites. Isaiah prophesied correctly about you when he said, these people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. They worship me in vain, teaching as doctrines the commands of men. So just that small passage there, but Jesus lays it out and quotes Isaiah. Thinking about that passage, I think you hit it in the beginning, like the hearts of people. But like, what do you think of? What sticks out at you when you start to hear those verses?
yeah, I mean, what a great diagnosis of everything we're talking about. It starts off with hypocrites, right? And gets to the heart of the matter. You know what's interesting is I was just comparing the thing that Matthew is stating here. It's the fact that these people are trying to be holy, right? At least they're attempting to. They're saying, "Hey, what holiness means is you have to do X, Y, and Z, and this is how you live it out." I think we almost have an opposite problem where it's like it doesn't matter, nothing is holy, holy,
Right.
right? Like you lose the sacredness of the building, but it's also probably a message that is just kind of a feel good message. Like Jesus died for you, do whatever you want, right? There isn't a call toward the cross, right? Like carrying your cross, following him in some sort of way. It is this shallow view of Jesus himself. So it's just interesting where you have almost like the opposite problem. It's not a call toward taking human rules and implying it on yourself. It's almost the opposite of just cheapening grace that I think we see in our day. But that's sort of my take here.
No, it's exactly what I was thinking of too. And I've referenced this many times. One of the small group curriculums that really changed and shaped my thinking is the gospel centered life and like how you view the cross and its magnitude and impact in your life as you grow in your Christian life. And as you grow in your Christian life, you see God as holy and your awareness of his holiness increases and increases. And to your point, like sometimes like we plateau that at a certain point, which minimizes the impact of the gospel in my life because as I grow in my awareness of God's holiness, I also start to see how sinful I am. And that gap gets wider and wider and wider. And the thing that bridges the gap is the cross. And, I was reading a curriculum earlier today where it actually, you know, it talks about why we pretend and why we perform. And a lot of times when we perform, it's because we're actually shrinking the cross and its impact in our life. And
Mhm.
we're not really thinking about the holiness of God. And yeah, it's really interesting. I think that's a great point. And like the people who should know this the best, like the Pharisees and the scribes and everyone who should know this best are obviously not practicing it, right?
Yeah. 100%. And and even on that note on holiness, I think it's because we don't feel the immediate sort of judgment of God that we take it sort of for granted, right? I think about all those examples sometimes we look at in the Old Testament where God, the people of Israel complain against Moses and Aaron, and God gets angry and he almost starts killing them in some sort of way, whether it's a plague or something breaks out in the camp, and then Moses and Aaron go toward the tent and say, like, Lord, just spare these people, right? And God's wrath sort of subsides, right? And the reason sometimes, and that's just one example. Sometimes we think about even, when Moses disobeys God in front of the people and God tells him, "You're not going to go to the promised land." Man, I'd see that as so unfair, but really it's unfair to me because I don't understand the holiness of God, right? Like we don't understand the
Mm,
call to be holy, and therefore we sort of lose sight of that when we think about, hey man, this is so unfair for Moses. Sometimes when we think about some of the things that we read about in Revelation, right? We were just reading about the four horsemen of the apocalypse, if you will, in Revelation chapter 6, and some of the judgments that are coming in terms of like a fourth of the world, right, will be essentially slain, right? That's today's estimate's 2 billion people. You could look at that and say, like,
jeez.
this is crazy, right? Like, this is unheard of. This is, why would God do that? But it's because we don't understand his holiness that we
Yeah.
allowed this sort of celebrity pastor. Let's just go put a basketball court on stage and pour maple syrup on the Bible and be the brown worship leader that does whatever they want on a weekend and goes up on a Sunday just to get the praise of people.
Yeah. That's pretty convicting and kind of scary when you put it that way, right? Because I think we've veered so much the other way from the fire and brimstone messages. And we're like, church shouldn't be scary. Like, why are you yelling at me? Right. I think that's kind of maybe the churches that we grew up in or just have this like feeling of like, why is everything so harsh? And we've veered so much the other way where you have people pouring maple syrup on the Bible. Like you gotta come back. There is some awe and fear that we should have when it comes to the gospel and like what judgment really is. Obviously, there's grace, but it's all not like a bed of roses. Like there's a reason why Jesus died. Like, what is the wages of those of sin, right? And I think that's where I'm getting at. Like, we understand why this turns people off from like Christianity because they see this hypocrisy. But then, like I'm glad you brought up this move towards traditional Christianity because it's not that all these Protestant churches are bad in their doctrine. It's probably because they're distorting the gospel itself. And so I think that's where I kind of want to understand, do these performative Christians, or if you're listening to this and you're like, man, I live my life a completely different way Monday through Saturday, and I am that worship leader and I do play music and I just learn the songs and that's all I do. Like, I hope this is convicting for you because what you're doing is distorting the gospel and it actually twists what people might actually believe about the saving work of Jesus Christ. So, like, when you see that, how does this portray Christianity? Like, from the audience, and they're looking at this, like, what do you think their thoughts are? What does it make them feel like when they see hypocrites on stage?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I think people that are inside of the church, we could almost spot
Yeah.
hypocrisy more, right? Like, you have to actually be part of the body in order to kind of, really see sheep for what they are. I think others, again, when you have an eccentric pastor that just does all sorts of nonsense, the masses pick it up. But, how do people sort of see it? How do they sort of feel it? What does it portray to Christianity? What's interesting is, and maybe I'll go the counter way. I think growing up, a lot of us have heard the phrase like, the church is not the building, right? It's the people. 100%. We all agree with that phrase. We are the church. It's not about the building. But sometimes nowadays, like you find churches be like, oh, let's buy a warehouse, let's put a coffee shop in front of it, and not gonna knock any of that stuff. But we try to make everything familiar. We try to make everything common. We try to make everything an experience. But what we actually lose in that is kind of just saying like Christianity is just like everything else. And right now, one of the things that we're seeing, at least in Gen Z, is everything else kind of sucks. Everything else right now in the world is really bad. Everything else causes anxiety. You see people always arguing. You see everything is common. What is different, right? And one of the things that I will at least say for the traditional churches, when you walk into an Orthodox sanctuary and you see the iconography just all across, the stage and all around you, there's a sense of like, okay, this place is different, right? There is people, there's the sense of, like we are connected to this history and lineage of Christianity. And I see these people that have gone before us all sort of surrounding us, giving me a sense of like where I am in place and time right now. When you walk into sort of a Catholic church and you look in the front, especially when they bring out like the Eucharist, this idea, and you go through the mass and the celebration of it, you start to understand like this is different. This is different from everything else in the world. This is different from everything else in my life. And so there is this idea of, how does it portray Christianity? It just makes it so common. It makes it so like everything else when we just try to come down and just make it familiar and an experience for people. But we're sort of losing the reverence. We're sort of losing the uniqueness of what it ought to be. And I think and I'll just say it from a Protestant perspective, I think that's a failure sort of on our part. We have to have an idea of like, how do we make this a set apart dwelling place of reverence toward God? And it doesn't need to be the building, but it definitely has to come through in the service. That's my opinion. I don't know if you have a counter opinion to that.
No, I think it's a great point, and, like, what you said really struck me about, like, we make it like everything else when we actually understand the story of the gospel. It is unlike anything ever, right? And we can't get into the minds and the hearts of the people who are on the outside of the church. Like, it's really hard to understand their intent and their insights and their perspective. But we hear the noise when we cite some of these statistics. That's loud and clear, right? That people have a perception of the church in a negative way, and I think we have to address that. We have to understand what we're doing. And if we just say, hey, our buildings are full, our tithes and offerings are up, but we're not understanding that it actually distorts the gospel and makes it look like everything else, it really takes away the impact and the powerful. Not that you can't make the gospel less powerful than it is. You're just not, preaching it effectively. So I think that's where, like, what do we do? Like, how do we apply this when we say, hey, for the folks who are leading churches, and maybe we take it from there to say, hey, if you're leading churches or you're part of the worship team and you feel convicted by some of these things that we're saying, like you are partaking in a church that you see stuff that you're kind of questioning. Like, what should those folks do? Like, how can they actually take note of this, not just be constant complainers, right? And just keep submitting complaints in the complaint box and disparaging the church. Like, what's the practical next steps for those folks to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. Right? And again, maybe I came off more on the sense of like just leave your church and go towards
Yeah.
something traditional, right? Like there was no traditional churches in Acts 2, right? They were gathered in a common upper room for a very uncommon experience, right? They gathered in houses, they gathered in courtyards. But it wasn't where they gathered. It was something about the gathering itself that was purported to be holy, which is the exact reason why Paul takes such offense for Peter showing favoritism at a communal meal at the gathering. Why? Because this is supposed to be different. It's not supposed to be like the separation that we see in the world. What should we do, therefore, with all this information? That's a great question. I think For me personally, one thing I was really thinking about and struck by is maybe a quote that Francis Chan said a little bit ago. And he is sort of on his own journey too. So I'm curious to see where he ends up. But with Francis Chan specifically, I think he brought up this idea that we've reduced Western Christianity down to sort of a man and a band, right? Really, it is the message and this worship sort of experience. And I've been really marinating on this recently, right? Like if we were to think about Christianity universally, what unifies all of us as sort of Christians? What practices you should unify all of us? And I think there's this idea of we need to put communion really back into the forefront of our churches. It is sad that a lot of big mega churches do not regularly celebrate communion when it is clearly commanded that, hey, every single time y'all gather, do this in remembrance of me. If we really think about, another sort of, I forgot where I heard it again, if you don't have a sacrifice sort of at the altar, it's just a stage. And that's an interesting concept of when we celebrate the sacrifice of Jesus and the way that he wanted it to be celebrated. That's what makes this a worship, right? That's what makes it an altar. If we're missing that, it really does become just a feel good message and a story. So, one thing I would say is, can we at least consider going to a place that regularly celebrates communion? Because that's something that all of Christianity has done from the beginning up till now, and something that I think at least centers us symbolically to what it's all about. It's not about the message as much, or it's not about you being able to participate in songs. Those are all sort of add-ons in my opinion. It is about remembering the body and the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus Christ and celebrating it in an intangible way in a regular cadence. That's my 2 cents there.
Yeah, I think that's a great practical way to almost like make your Sundays remind you of the true gospel and like the true message of what we're supposed to be doing. And like I think back to like the churches that we grew up in, smaller churches, and they didn't have the logistical problem of like, oh, we can't do communion every single Sunday, or you have a lot of outsiders. Like you had a very small insular church and you knew everybody and you could do communion. And that was one of the logistical operational things that I've come to realize. But it was really great that we did it every single Sunday. And ever since I was a kid, it was just like, wow, this is the most reverent moment of the Sunday service.
Mhm.
And it's really important to do that. I think just even looking at our passage where Jesus says, their hearts are far from me. Well, what should we do if we fall into some of these situations? Let's get our heart closer to God. Like, how do we do that? And I think about like James 4, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Like this active moment of not just seeking God, but like actually trying to make your house, make your heart a dwelling place for him, right? Like craft our hearts as the tabernacle, right? Like to your point about it's not just the building, but like actually taking the time to put together all the little details of your own life that is inhabitable for God himself to dwell like in you, right? And I think that's something that I think personally that we start to do. And then once we start to do that, once you see these performative things, it's not going to resonate with you, right? You're not going to be like, well, I love the music, so I'm going to go there, right? And I think to your point, we shouldn't be just like willy nilly, just, hey, I'm going to leave this church because of this, right? But once you get closer to God and he draws near to you, I think it illuminates like the places and the healthy places that we should be in and distracts us away from the places that we shouldn't be, right?
Yeah. And
So
hopefully you're doing that in community too, right? Like if it's as you attempt to draw near to God, hopefully you're finding yourself in churches and places where there's a band of people doing it with you as well, right? It's not just an attendance and leaving, but really it's a collective sort of community of people seeking to do that. They can walk alongside you. And that's really what it is, right? That's really comes back to what the church sort of ought to be. I think maybe before we end, I was going to say one more sort of thought just popped in my mind. You talked a little bit about how it's distorting the gospel, right? When we really take hypocrisy, performance, and just minimize sort of like the holiness of God here. I think one of the other things that was just popping into my mind as we are having this conversation is there is a problem. I think maybe it's just gone on for so long and we just don't want to call it out. I think this idea of we're deconstructing Christianity is a phenomena that we heard in the last couple of years. I think it's been going on for a while. Really in hindsight, if we think about the deconstruction of Christianity into the common sort of worship service that we see today it really is a, hey, we don't need, you know, this sort of responsive reading of a psalm anymore. Let's throw it out. We don't need to do communion every single Sunday. Let's throw it out. We don't need to do blah 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 blah. Let's just make it as easy and simple and whatever is possible, because we just need to get, the most amount of people in the doors that they can hear about Jesus, And for a while, we can debate and say, was that a good thing? Was that a bad thing? But I do think it's put us on a trajectory that's sort of allowed for a distortion, right? When you take away these and deconstruct things that almost anchor you to something greater, then it's easier for us to distort, the gospel. But when you do have solid anchors towards something that's greater than you, it's almost harder to distort the picture. I don't know if you have a take on that or you kind of understand where I'm coming from. But I think
Yeah.
the distortion is allowed because we have deconstructed just so much.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's a really great point. The thought that came into my mind is I actually remember you doing a Psalms reading. I think it was like Psalm 67, like where let God's face shine on you. Like all of that stuff. Like I remember you doing that Psalms reading because I think you started doing a devotional. This is like years ago, man. I don't even know if you remember this, but you did like this devotional and it really tied into like the benediction and all this kind of stuff. And I was just like, man, why do we do Psalms reading? Because we have a sermon too. But like I got something out of like what you were sharing in that moment. And I remember, and you probably recall when we were young, we would do all these youth meetings and there'd be like, all right, we got to have a Psalms reading. We got to have these programs. It was like anchored into the program. And I'd always question it when I was young, but then I realized later, I'm like, wow, this was really formative for me to understand like a way that we went into the service. Not that every single church has to have this prescription, but even to your point, that we start to deconstruct from some of these practices and I think it's really healthy to maybe go through some of the ebbs and flows because then we get way too traditional and then we start to put our faith in the traditions and then we start to make that the altar and then we don't rely on the gospel and then we start to move away from it. So I think maybe throughout church history you'll probably see this like we have these ebbs and flows, but like if we truly always make the gospel the anchor, then we'll have the key pieces of our church services always there, right? Like we have to have prayer, we have to have scripture, we have to have song, like some of the key core pillars that keep reminding us and communion, all of those things that remind us of Jesus. I think it's really interesting and we shouldn't like be discouraged because we are changing practices, right? Like we might have to say, well, we've gone so far the other way. We got to get back to this. And I think if it always points us back to Jesus and the gospel, then why not do that?
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. And I was gonna say, just as we close off here, yeah, and I think one more reel just popped into my mind. There's all these reels right now that just kind of say like, let's check in on the Protestant Reformation and see how it's going. And I remember one, it was just a dude on roller skates, just roller skating during it's like a roller skate worship set. And I'm like, what the heck is going on? Right. And you even think about some of the other nonsense that we've seen in really churches that are no longer adhering to the authority of scripture when it comes to a lot of secular and sexual identity related issues. It's just again one of those things where it's like, man, that's really the danger here, right? Like when we are doing performative Christianity and we're not really elevating the authority of the gospel of scripture, we're forgetting about the holiness, we end up with a so-called church that truly isn't the body of Christ anymore, right?
Yeah.
At what point does that become the line that we've crossed? And I think the further we go along with this performance and hypocrisy, that's really the line that we're going to be driving toward rather than toward where God actually is.
Yeah. I think a couple questions that if you're listening to this and you're like wondering what's going on, like ask yourself, are you pursuing God? Are you pursuing a feeling? Are you worshiping or like consuming a show? Right. Think about where you're at and where your church is. And maybe even individually, like, have you been hypocritical in your heart in any way, shape, or form? And how could you pursue authenticity? Right. And how can you actually live life like who you truly are. And I think you alluded to like small groups and things like that. So I think this is a really good, legitimate complaint that people have about the church, but there are ways that we can apply and get out of it. But really great conversation, Jeswin. Looking forward to unpacking more from the complaint box to see what's going on and what people are addressing regarding the church. So please continue to share your feedback. We love to hear your comments, questions, DM us. But make sure you like, subscribe, follow us for more for future episodes on the Complete Box series.
Yeah, and
Till
unfollow
next
Mike
time.
Todd.
Man, he probably blocked us already.
It's fine. We're too small for him.
We're okay. Yes. Jesus is bigger.